So coming up this Saturday, we have the big super featherweight title clash between Anthony Cacace and Leigh Wood. A fight that certainly ought to be a banger, but a fight that I'm referring to as the fight in spite of Eddie Hearn. Now the focus should always be around the athletes, especially for a fight that is projected to be so good in the ring. But when we look at what a lot of the talk around this fight has been, especially when you look at the interviews that were conducted on the day of the launch press conference for this fight back in February, and when you look at the situation with Anto Cacace vacating his IBF super featherweight title, Mr. Hearn has happened to be a pertinent topic of discussion when it comes to this upcoming fight. So in a nutshell, Anthony Cacace fights under Frank Warren's Queensberry Promotions, the renowned rival promotion of Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing. And Cacace was the IBF super featherweight champion, but he didn't lose that belt in the ring. Just 3 months back, he vacated the world title so he didn't have to defend it against his mandatory challenger, Eduardo Sugar Nunez, who is promoted by Eddie Hearn. Cacace opted out of the Nunez fight to go for a more lucrative fight with the returning Leigh Wood in Wood's hometown of Nottingham, headlining Queensberry Boxing's second show on the DAZN platform. However, Eddie Hearn claims that the money that Cacace is getting to fight Leigh Wood is only a very slightly higher sum of money than he would have got to defend his world title against his man in the ever dangerous Sugar Nunez. So Eddie Hearn then began to accuse Cacace of ducking Nunez, as it must be a duck if he'd give up his world title for what is apparently a bit of extra change. Oh, and the man who Cacace is fighting instead of Nunez, Leigh Wood of course, on this big Queensberry show, is a fighter who left Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing. So Eddie has an issue with both men in this fight, each for different reasons, hence the fight in spite of Eddie Hearn. But there's a bit more to it than that. So let's take a little look into the timeline of things here. On the topic of Matchroom and Queensberry rivalries, it wouldn't be right for me to not go back and mention how Cacace actually won the IBF super featherweight strap that he's now vacated. So Anthony the Apache Cacace was already the reigning British super featherweight champ with a record of 18-1 when he signed with Queensberry Promotions in 2020. And fast forward to 2022, he actually won the IBO World Super Featherweight title, so Cacace is no chump. But in May of 2024, Cacace would get his big shot at the IBF World Super Featherweight title, a legit world title, against Matchroom Boxing's Joe Cordina on the undercard of Fury vs Usyk 1 in Riyadh. Now on the grand scheme of things, the then 35-year-old Cacace was not a very popular fighter at that point, and this fight was more of a chance for the Eddie Hearn promoted star Joe Cordina to defend his title on a big stage. In actuality, this fight was far from a mismatch, but when you look at the odds, you can see that Hearn's man Cordina was very much the A-side here, for he was a massive favourite and Cacace was a 4-1 underdog going into that fight. Now when the fight would commence, it was fought at a pretty high pace, and Cacace would drop Cordina quite hard in the third round. Cordina survived the knockdown, but in the rounds following, Cacace would keep the pressure on, throwing tight shots from the inside at a high output until ultimately stopping Cordina on the feet in round 8. TKO win for Cacace in what was a great performance and a massive upset on a big stage. He was the new IBF Super Featherweight champion and he had made his name known to a bigger audience. Well, he was the unified IBF and IBO champ. A memorable moment about this fight was when Cacace ran to his promoter Frank Warren to celebrate his world title fight upset victory over their Eddie Hearn fighter. And this Cacace vs Cordina fight in the Kingdom Arena in Saudi Arabia came just 2 weeks before the Matchroom vs Queensberry 5 vs 5 card in the Kingdom Arena. And Team Queensberry of course went on to clean sweep Team Matchroom on that card. So Cacace's win over Matchroom's Cordina was almost the predecessor or the teaser for how the head-to-head battle between Queensberry and Matchroom would play out. Now Anto Cacace's next fight would not be an IBF mandatory defence. He would instead face off against Matchroom's Josh Warrington on the undercard of AJ vs Dubois in Wembley Stadium in September. So another title fight against a Matchroom fighter on a massive card headlined by a heavyweight title fight. But despite Cacace still being the IBF champ at that point, only his lesser regarded IBO belt was on the line for that fight, because the IBF did not sanction the bout as Warrington was not a ranked super featherweight. This was his debut in the weight class. So I suppose Warrington being a former 2-time reigning IBF featherweight champ wasn't enough. But in this fight now, Anthony Cacace would outbox Josh Warrington over the 12-round distance to win a pretty wide unanimous decision to remain champion. So the Irishman who waited years and years to get his due now held 2 consecutive wins on massive Riyadh season shows, both against Matchroom stars. And of course, fast forward to the main event that night, Daniel Dubois vs Anthony Joshua, that was of course another Queensberry vs Matchroom affair, at the highest level of notoriety, and Queensberry's Dubois would absolutely batter Matchroom's Anthony Joshua to defend his title. Of course, Joshua is Eddie's main man as well. So Anto Cacace's 2 wins over Matchroom, guys, came within that period of Matchroom's quite damning losing streak that Eddie Hearn got absolutely clowned for. A losing streak in which I detail in my "Is it the worst time to be an Eddie Hearn fighter" video. I'll leave a link to that one in the top of the description. So with Eddie Hearn going around calling Cacace a duck, I know Eddie Hearn does do a good job of pushing for his fighters to get their mandatory shots anyway, but best believe in this instance, Eddie Hearn does feel a type of way about Queensberry's Anto Cacace, and it's not just about Eduardo Nunez finally getting his shot. But let's take a look at this mandatory situation with Nunez now anyway. So Eduardo Sugar Nunez was actually the IBF mandatory contender at super featherweight before Anto Cacace even won that IBF title in May of 2024. Back in February of 2024, Nunez had his 12-round IBF final eliminator bout against former Joe Cordina foe Shavkat Rakhimov in Rakhimov's home nation of Tajikistan. And Nunez stopped Rakhimov in round 11 to become the IBF number 1 contender. So the Mexican was actually mandatory for what was then Joe Cordina's belt. But since Nunez became the IBF number 1, Cordina lost that belt to Anthony Cacace, and then the new champion Cacace had a fight that the IBF belt wasn't even on the line for. So there hasn't been an IBF mandatory fight in the weight class for a good while. And while sitting on that IBF mandatory position, Nunez had one fight in the interim against Miguel Mariaga, a fight in which Nunez won by stoppage. So next up for the Matchroom man was to be his title shot. So by the time Cacace vacated the IBF strap to opt out of the Sugar Nunez fight back in January, Nunez had already been mandatory for a couple weeks shy of a year. So as a result of Cacace vacating, number 1 contender Nunez is of course in line for a vacant title fight. And he will take on Masanori Rikishi over in Japan for the vacant world title belt later this month. But of course, Eddie Hearn would have preferred for Nunez to dethrone the reigning and defending world champion from the British Isles in Cacace, a fight that could have headlined a fairly big show domestically. But instead, his man Nunez has got to go have a vacant title fight in Japan, which is all long. Now I say defending champ, but Cacace technically never defended that IBF belt. So yeah, in response to Cacace vacating the belt and not fighting Nunez, Eddie Hearn basically rubbished off the idea that Cacace would be making way more money to fight Leigh Wood in Nottingham, as mentioned earlier in the video. Eddie Hearn acknowledged that Cacace would be making more money to fight Wood, but not a lot of money at all, and not enough money for him to be giving up his belt and ruin bigger financial opportunities as a world champion, such as unifications. So essentially, for Cacace to see the Wood fight as a better option than keeping his world title belt, well, if it ain't worth Cacace fighting Nunez to go on and have bigger opportunities as a world champion, that means Cacace must see the fight against the dangerous Mexican as too big of a risk. He must feel that there's a good chance that he won't keep his world title belt in that fight. So he gives up his belt for a nice payday against an inactive Leigh Wood. And Eddie spoke about how Cacace was originally negotiating with him to fight Nunez, but Cacace and Queensberry messed Eddie Hearn and his man Nunez around by swerving the fight. Now to look at the other side of the story, Anto Cacace claims that the money he will be making to fight Leigh Wood will be 2 times the amount of money that he would have been making to fight Sugar Nunez, and that Eddie Hearn is lying with all of his claims about the marginal financial difference, the ducking and the swerving. So here's the thing, Cacace is 36 years old. The Cordina and Warrington fights, his last 2 fights, would have been his biggest paydays by far in his now over 13-year-long pro career. And Cacace said himself that he's not rich. And if we take his word for it that he'll be making twice as much to fight Wood than he would have been to fight Nunez, then we can't really blame him here. But look, as actual boxing fans, we're worried about good fights between accomplished fighters, rather than pocket watching and pondering about how much another man gets paid. Of course we hope they can make a good living from boxing, and we're happy for the fighters when they get paid handsomely, but we really shouldn't be too fussed about the intricacies of their fight purses. So money aside, because we're not obsessed with what another man is getting paid, Anto Cacace has almost objectively ducked Sugar Nunez because he gave up his world title, a great signifier of being a current top level fighter, in order to not fight Nunez. But when it comes to the whole thing of fans wanting a good product, best believe Cacace vs Wood is going to be a great fight in the ring. It now won't be an IBF world title fight, just an IBO world title fight, of course a lesser regarded belt, but one that can be used to sell Cacace vs Wood as a world title fight. You can hear more about the IBO world title in this recent video of mine. Link will be in the top of the description for that, just below that Eddie Hearn video that I mentioned earlier. But the main point here is that this upcoming fight is not going to be widely regarded as a world title fight. However, it doesn't matter because it's in the infamous Leigh Wood's hometown of Nottingham. They'll do absolute numbers on the game, the atmosphere will be mesmerising, and the fight is almost guaranteed to be a banger. It's also a cool little story that this is the return of Leigh Wood, who was a star by the standard of a UK fighter in the lower weight classes back in 2022 and 2023. And in Leigh Wood's absence, Anthony Cacace has gone on to reach his own level of stardom. And as for the fight shaping up to be a banger in the ring, overriding the fact that this is not a proper world title fight, well, when Leigh Wood defeated Michael Conlan in a fight that got Ring Magazine Fight of the Year in 2022, that fight was just for the WBA regular world title. But that fight ain't remembered as just a WBA regular world title fight, it's remembered as a great fight that got Fight of the Year. So I think that Eddie Hearn has every right to call Cacace a duck for giving up his world title belt to avoid fighting his man Nunez, regardless of what Cacace is getting paid. Because again, what do we really care about what another guy is getting paid? And Cacace versus Nunez would have been a great fight that I definitely would have watched. But to me, there's a lot more to a Cacace versus Wood fight in regards to selling it to a casual audience in the UK. And I think that Queensberry have done a great job for putting on this fight, whether or not it was in spite of Eddie Hearn who wanted a big fight for his man Nunez. Because at the end of the day, Leigh Wood is back, and we're going to get a great fight. And I have no bias towards either Matchroom or Queensberry. Neither of them pay me, and I'm not associated with anyone who works for or fights under either promotion. But it is a little bit funny how the existence of this fight just mugs off Eddie Hearn in every way, I'll be honest. You had Warren, Cacace and Wood all happy and having a bubble at the launch presser talking about how great this event will be after the fight was announced. And you had Eddie Hearn just seething and having a big old moan in a dozen different interviews. Now this isn't me glorifying or even justifying a world champion giving up their title to duck a mandatory and make a few extra quid. But this situation just happens to be highly amusing to me. I think this was also around the time that Eddie Hearn was having them rants about Naoya Inoue, accusing Inoue of ducking his man MJ Akhmadaliev, so yeah, Eddie Hearn was just going off at that point. But now let's take a look at things more on the Leigh Wood side of things. So in July of 2021, Leigh Wood came in as quite the underdog to challenge WBA regular featherweight champion Zhu Can for that belt on the main event spot of a Matchroom show at the Matchroom headquarters. In that fight, Wood impressed everyone with a stoppage victory in the 12th and final round to become the new champion. Off the back of that, Eddie Hearn signed Wood to a multi-fight deal with Matchroom Boxing. Now under the Matchroom banner, Leigh Wood went on to have 4 great fights. And although Wood is the warrior doing the work in the ring, Eddie Hearn kinda did make him a star. His first fight as a Matchroom fighter was in his hometown of Nottingham, in the Nottingham Arena. And that was his fight of the year with Michael Conlan. Next up, he was in the Nottingham Arena headlining again. This time he was defending his WBA title against Mauricio Lara. Wood actually got stopped in that fight, but the rematch was then made right away, a headline in Manchester just 3 months later, and he avenged the loss with a unanimous decision victory. Then there was the big Josh Warrington fight in Sheffield, a main event again, and Wood knocked out the former 2-time world featherweight champ to keep his WBA featherweight title. That was back in October of 2023, and it's Leigh Wood's last fight to date, so Wood has been inactive for a year and a half. So at what point in that long stint of inactivity was it reported that Leigh Wood left the Matchroom stable then? Well, it was only 5 months after the Warrington fight, in February of 2024. Wood had vacated the featherweight title and wanted a rematch with Warrington up at super featherweight. But the main issue here wasn't the weight, it was the location. If you know anything about Leigh Wood outside of watching him in the ring, you'll know that he is obsessed with the idea of fighting at the City Ground, the stadium of Nottingham Forest FC, his boyhood club. So I guess the Nottingham Arena, where his 2 first fights with Matchroom took place, doesn't quite suffice. Wood claims that the inability for Matchroom to get him a fight at the City Ground was actually a breach of contract from their part. And Wood has expressed how the Warrington fight would have been the perfect fight for the City Ground due to the size of the fight. So after that fight took place in Sheffield and he beat Warrington, then the only feasible stadium fight was the Warrington rematch. However, half a year after Wood became a free agent, and 11 months after that Wood vs Warrington fight, in September 2024, Warrington had his first fight since that fight with Wood, which was his aforementioned loss to Anto Cacace. So that rematch with Warrington isn't really a thing for Leigh Wood now, as Warrington has lost to Cacace. So now it only makes sense for Wood to fight Cacace in his comeback fight. But Wood himself explained how Cacace is not as big a star as Warrington, so fighting Cacace at the City Ground isn't really realistic. But the money made sense with the Cacace fight. Cacace is a Queensberry fighter, and of course, Wood was a free agent, and Queensberry are putting the fight on in the Nottingham Arena for Wood's comeback. So it's all lined up well for Wood to come back and fight on Queensberry. And by the way, the making of this fight is Leigh Wood's first time working with Frank Warren. So practically, Leigh Wood left Matchroom because they couldn't get him a fight in the Nottingham Stadium. But Wood is coming back to fight under Matchroom's rival promotion Queensberry, and the fight's going to be in the Nottingham Arena anyway. But of course, the Cacace fight is the one that makes the most sense out of the available fights for Wood, and he claims that Frank Warren is the man who will be able to get him a fight in the City Ground at some point. Obviously, he will have to beat Cacace if he hopes to go on and have a fight that's big enough to headline in a stadium, so if he does lose on Saturday, he might end up like Carl Froch, retiring having never fought in the City Ground, just a Nottingham Arena time after time. And of course, another factor with this whole Matchroom vs Queensberry discussion is the deal that Queensberry have signed with DAZN. As many of you will know, Matchroom made boxing on DAZN a thing, as the DAZN platform became the home of Matchroom USA in 2018 and then the home of Matchroom Boxing as a whole in 2021. Eddie Hearn was the one who backed this streaming service several years ago and built it to where it is today. Well, definitely in regards to boxing. But now Queensberry are just going to step in and come onto the same platform, and now Matchroom are going to have to make sure that their schedule doesn't clash with Queensberry's. Diabolical work. So seeing as Cacace vs Wood is the fight in spite of Eddie Hearn, it would have been fitting if this was Queensberry's inaugural DAZN show. But of course, the first show was that Heavy Impact card that took place last month. But that card was hurt by a couple of pullouts, so Queensberry didn't quite make the Heavy Impact that they intended on their DAZN inauguration. But Cacace vs Wood is of course the second Queensberry DAZN card, and was a part of that free card announcement that Queensberry made when first signing with DAZN, along with that Heavy Impact card obviously, and the Taylor vs Esserman card coming up on the 24th. So as for who I reckon will win this fight between Anthony Cacace and Leigh Wood, look, Cacace is the rightful favourite. He's floating around at 1 to 2 I think, but I think you can find him as high as a 4 to 6 on some bookies, which is worthy of a 3-figure stake in my eyes. Leigh Wood does have quite the leaky defense. He's been stopped before and dropped multiple times in his career, which Cacace hasn't. And of course, Cacace and Wood both have a common opponent in both of their last opponent, Josh Warrington. And it's fair to say that Warrington managed to do more damage on Wood than he did Cacace, while that fight lasted. Also, Wood is of course coming off of a long stint of inactivity, and he's never fought up at super featherweight at this level before. So smart money is on Anto Cacace this Saturday night. But let's just hope that Cacace vs Wood is a fun one, after all those fights we saw on Friday and Saturday just gone. Obviously we did have the O.M.E fight on the Sunday, which was a lot more exciting, as we expected, and it is actually now confirmed that O.M.E will fight Matchroom's MJ Akhmadaliev in September. But yeah, that was one long weekend of boxing, and I watched all 3 of the cards live, and I pretty much watched the entirety of all of them. I was doing a lot of community posts about each fight at the time, so the 3 or 4 of you who do see my community posts, you will know some of my takes already, but there are a couple of fights from the weekend that I will be discussing further in future videos. Time was a bit too tight for an immediate reaction though, let's just say that. And time's even too tight for me to be making this video right now, I'll be honest, but I really did want to do this one. But yeah, thanks for watching the video. Leave your predictions for Cacace vs Wood in the comments down below, and you have been listening to O.M.E Boxing.